see, you've got to be very careful calling Dunkirk a success. Because as Churchill said...
It's a failure.
It's a failure.
Yeah.
It's a defeat. But within that defeat, there is this remarkable achievement that keeps the war going.
I mean, surely the Germans realise, hang on a minute, the Allies are evacuating. Does that not change the German thinking?
Yes, it does, but they're being held up. They were held up in Boulogne. Mm-hmm. Churchill put forces into Boulogne. He put forces into Calais, so they're delayed coming along the coast.
It's a civilian flotilla that does much of the heavy lifting. Where does that idea...
No,
You're going to push back on that?
No,
it's
no,
not.
no.
It's
I'm
not.
afraid I'm going to push back on that.
OK, go on then, correct me.
Absolutely not.
To what extent was it a miracle? How miraculous was it?
Well,
and how close did it come to failing?
Well, it came very close to failure. I mean, the miracle is such a loaded word, isn't it? Because it's got this sense of the divine.
Divine intervention, yeah.
But that's what was preached at St Paul's immediately afterwards, and that was the mood of the country. Nobody thought they were going to lose in Britain.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, my mother, who's God bless her, 95 now, remembers distinctly that nobody in the wake of Dunkirk thought there was, or even while Dunkirk was going on, that we would lose.
It's the 26th of May, 1940, and the British Expeditionary Force is in total crisis. Sent to help defend France from the German blitzkrieg, the army had found themselves overpowered and driven back towards northern France and the English Channel. They were seemingly trapped, with nowhere to go. But on the 24th of May, a halt order to the ground campaign was issued by the German High Command, which gave the British time to plan their escape. A daring, highly unlikely, yet ultimately successful evacuation that saw over 338,000 men rescued. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, this was the miracle of Dunkirk. James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or tide of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. This episode is sponsored by Visit Malta. Right in the heart of the Mediterranean, Malta is a blend of history, culture, nature and hospitality. To find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. Well, today we're discussing the evacuation of British forces at Dunkirk. What was in actuality a damning defeat has gone down in history as a staggering achievement which kept British forces going for the remainder of the war. Yet what if it hadn't succeeded and Britain lost the bulk of the BEF in 1940? That's a question for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by Joshua Levine, who was the historical consultant on the brilliant Christopher Nolan movie Dunkirk. So here we have our big map in front of us of continental Europe as it would have been around the time of Dunkirk in 1940, in May of 1940. Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you alongside me. Just sum up how much trouble the BEF is in late May of 1940. They are trapped at Dunkirk, here in northern France. Why are they in so much trouble?
Well, they're trapped in a pocket, actually, that extends out from Dunkirk. And what has happened is that the Germans have invaded Poland, of course, in September 1939. They've also just invaded Denmark and Norway, possibly to preempt a move by the British to actually seize the routes for the iron ore mines from Sweden. On the back of that, they've launched an invasion of the Netherlands and Belgium with what they call Army Group B. And that is essentially a feint. That's designed to attract the French and British forces, which indeed it does. They go up to a line on the River Dyle and they block Army Group B. But Army Group B's job is to fix the enemy. All the while, Army Group A, in the very famous sickle cut, which was devised by von Manstein, is actually cutting through the Ardennes via Sedan. It's crossing the Meuse, and it's totally going to cut off the British Expeditionary Force and the French armies in the north from their confrères in the south. And essentially, the dividing line is the River Somme. And what we've got is a situation where German armoured forces are streaking across France here to the north of Paris. They're leaving their infantry and a lot of their logistics behind. They're supported by the Luftwaffe, which is quite important. And there is a real danger that the British Expeditionary Force and the remaining French forces in the north here are going to be squeezed between Army Group B and Army Group A. And it's a question of whether the Germans, when they reach the coast, then sweep round and take out Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk.
Joshua, welcome to History Undone. Great to have you on the channel. Put us in the minds of the Germans at this time. I mean, they've had this remarkable success sweeping through France and Western Europe. At this point, leading up to Dunkirk, how are they thinking?
Well, they've been very, very successful up till now. So you've got, I mean, I think in terms of Germany, it does pay to always think of Hitler. Hitler was the man whose decisions counted. He was, you know, this was not a democracy. This was kind of a one-man show in some ways. And so Hitler, up till now, had made the right decisions. And that really gave him a kind of confidence that he was always going to make the right decisions. You know, he had confidence to begin with. And here, so we're talking about, you know, Army Group B up here. We've got the British Expeditionary Force, which has gone out to France at the beginning of the war. It's not particularly large, but the idea was that an attack would come through Belgium, because that's how the Germans did things. The British actually, interestingly, the British and French, weren't initially allowed into Belgium. Belgium was kind of trying to play a game whereby it knew that almost certainly the Germans were coming, but on the other hand, it didn't want to actively provoke them. Churchill was furious about this. You know, he talked about you know, feeding the crocodile so that, you know, you would be the last to be eaten. That's what he said Belgium was doing. Sure enough, Belgium was invaded. The Germans came. But as we say, this actually was only a feint. So you've got the British Expeditionary Force. They're in France for 8 months. You've got this strange situation. First of all, they are there where their fathers and uncles were, not long before. So, you know, like us, they're visiting the First World War cemeteries, and some of them are even seeing family members in there. They're very moved in the same way we are when we go. The difference is they might very shortly end up there themselves. And they eventually, when the Germans move forward on the 10th of May, so do the British. They move forward, expecting a kind of war of attrition, expecting pretty much what had happened in the last war, because one is always fighting the last war. And there they are, you know, ranged against the Germans up there. On the same day, you have Winston Churchill becoming Prime Minister, which itself is fascinating, because Churchill was really thought of as a dangerous adventurer. He'd made so many bad decisions throughout his career that certainly older people were really quite concerned at the fact that this you know, unreliable man was coming to power. But he came to power because essentially Chamberlain's government hadn't cut the mustard. He actually, you know, there'd been the disaster, Norway disaster, which had happened, you know, just not long before, and Churchill ought to have taken the blame.
But it was Chamberlain instead.
But it was Chamberlain who took the blame. You had all these members of Parliament who, in the Norway debate, which turned into a vote of confidence in the government, these members of Parliament who were damning the government, yet protecting Churchill. So you had Lloyd George saying Churchill must not be an air raid shelter for the government. And then you had really a choice of two, Lord Halifax and Churchill, you know, to become the next Prime Minister. Halifax said it would be difficult for him because he was in the House of Lords. That isn't true. I mean, I think probably Halifax felt that Churchill had a poisoned chalice here, and he didn't want to take it up.
Well, there may be a scenario in which, if Dunkirk had played out differently, Halifax still becomes Prime Minister after all, but we'll come on to that. Chris, before we get on to the events around the evacuation of Dunkirk itself, crucial context, of course, is the halt order that is issued by the German High Command on May the 24th?
Yeah. So there's a lot of mythology around this. There are a lot of factors that come into it. We've got to bear in mind, by this stage, the German panzers in particular, and the panzer divisions are really worn out. The mechanics are breaking down. Over half of the tanks aren't actually working at all. They've got access to fuel problems at this point. They've been taking fuel all the way across from petrol stations and French supplies, but they're running out. The guys themselves are pretty poor as well. They haven't slept for something like 3 days. The infantry are far behind. The logistics are far behind. And what I think has been overlooked is that there is an engagement at Arras between British and French tanks and also the Germans. And the 3rd SS Panzer Division actually runs away. And it's quite a crisis for the Germans. And there's a Major General there called Rommel. And he immediately says, I'm facing 5 divisions here. This gets back to Rundstedt, who is in command of Army Group A. He puts this back to Hitler and they say, right, if we're facing 5 divisions here, we need to consolidate. We need to actually make sure we're not going to get defeated.
Yeah.
And Halder himself, effectively the chief of the general staff in Germany, says, Hitler was superstitious all the way through. He was saying, there's something wrong here. It's going too well. And he said that they had this sort of sinister thing hanging over him. And this was enough for Rundstedt to convince him to pause at this point. Hitler also said, look, I know this territory, as Joshua said. He'd been here before.
Yeah.
He knew it was marshy. It's not great tank country.
No.
So why would you do that? So they make this decision to bring up the artillery, they bring up the infantry and say, we'll leave it to them. And then Goering enters the scene and says, we'll deal with this. We can deal with it from the air. So all this comes together. But for me, all this issue about the halt order comes about because of Rommel, who we know is a great hero for the Germans in North Africa afterwards. But in fact, at this point, he panics. There's no doubt about it. You look at the German correspondence and signalling here, he thinks he's facing 5 divisions, which he isn't.
But there's also a sense, I think, he's aggrandizing himself.
He is, you're right.
I mean, I think, Rommel was already aware of his legacy. Yeah. He was that kind of a person. And it was very much in his interest. He'd been given, this was the 7th Panzer Division. He'd been given huge problems by what actually was a very small, quickly put together unit. Yeah. You had, what was it, about something close to 90 tanks, but only very few of them were the Matilda IIs, which were the effective tanks that the British had. And then so you had an infantry. It was split. The counterattack was split into 2 different columns. Each had a few tanks, an infantry division, guns, but not many. And the fact is, as you say, that it caused a lot of problems. In fact, Rommel was nearly killed twice. During this event, the fact it had given him so much problems, there was no way he was ever going to admit that it was as small as it was.
Yeah.
I mean, what I find interesting about this whole campaign is if the French had been able to attack across the Meuse, 14th to the 16th, it would have been over. Because the Germans would have been stuck in the Ardennes. But what you had is a situation where the weakest French units, because they didn't expect the attack to come from that direction, are facing the strongest German ones. So they punched through.
And they're very defensive. The French attitude is very defensive. They built the Maginot Line, which, this series of supposedly impregnable forts, which, ils ne passeront pas, they won't pass. Well, they didn't pass because they didn't have to go through it.
Yes.
The other interesting thing is that Gort himself says, I don't want to go up into Belgium at all. Yeah. This looks to me like a feint. But of course, he's a junior coalition partner. He doesn't have the mass to be able to say to the French, just like in World War I, you can't say to the French, I don't like this at all, we shouldn't be doing it. But the French don't want to fight on their own country. They've been there before, so they want to go forward. And the other interesting thing, as we remember, is that was the original German plan.
Yes.
Until, if you remember, in February of that year, you had the intelligence documents captured after an air crash, the Germans didn't even think of going through the Ardennes. So the initial laydown is not bad, but this advance that is the problem. And as I said, Gort himself, head of the BEF, doesn't even want that.
So do you think it's unfair, Joshua, to say, because a lot of people would almost say that the Halt order is an example of German hubris at the time, that maybe it's Goering wanting the glory and to pick off the forces?
I think there's some of that, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Goering did say to Hitler, let us do it. The Luftwaffe, we've been loyal all the way through. You know, let the generals do it. They'll take the glory. They're not even Nazis. You know, these are old-style conservatives.
So there's a bit of that, but there is also some actual logic behind it.
Oh, there's plenty of logic. You know, as we've seen, you know, that the Germans were still expecting this, you know, attack from the south. They thought they still had lots of fighting to do. The tanks had got way ahead of the infantry, the supply lines. They were very vulnerable. They really were.
And Guderian and Hitler both said, we need to save the tanks for a higher task. And that higher task is turning south for Plan Red, which is, let's actually defeat the French.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks that, you know, the war's over once the sickle cut gets to the coast. It isn't.
It's not.
Yeah.
There are masses of French divisions here south of the Somme. And so the Germans are thinking, we've still got to defeat France.
And it should really be over even before the Germans reach the coast, because, you know, the troops were there to do it. You know, the units were there to do it.
And crucially, has it crossed the German High Command's minds that the Allies could be evacuated from Dunkirk?
Actually, funnily enough, the Germans worked out that the BEF was heading for an evacuation before the French did. It's a very interesting question when the British or when Gort decided to evacuate. Certainly, Churchill had no desire for an evacuation, and the generals back in England had no desire. Churchill kept coming out to France, and what he wanted were attacks. So, in fact, the Halt order really took place because the Halt order really took place because Churchill had directed a large-scale attack. And Gort knew that a large-scale attack really wasn't possible. But, you know, Churchill always had to be given something. And what he was given was that counterattack, which actually, although it failed in the sense that, you know, the British forces ended up back where they started, was a success because the Germans thought it was much stronger than it had been, and they fully believed that something like it was going to happen again.
I mean, Gort actually disobeys orders. Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, says, I want you to use your 2 reserve divisions to attack to the southwest, and Gort says, I'm not doing that. And what he does is he actually plugs a gap to the northeast that actually stops the Germans annihilating one of our divisions and also breaking through the line to the north. So Gort actually has a view about what he wants to do.
I don't think Gort gets the credit he deserves. Gort was, it is true, you know, his headquarters, there was a lot of disorganisation.
I think the problem, Joshua, is that he's not just the commander of the army in the north, he's also running the whole operation in France. So everything from officers' reports through to how do we defeat the Germans is on his desk.
I think on the big decisions, he gets them right. And the biggest is evacuation.
And basically, and also we will get into it later, he is very certain that he's going to put British troops on these ships before French. Yeah. And there's a real tussle, as we'll see later, between Churchill and him, and indeed some of his own subordinate generals about who's going to go on the ship.
And Chris, one final piece of context before we get into the events of the evacuation itself. Sort of a perimeter has been set up almost.
Well, definitely a perimeter. And you've got General Ronald Adams being given the task of actually putting our forces in a defensive posture in this pocket, which takes in Calais, Boulogne, and also Dunkirk. And you've also got French forces at Lille. Yeah. Nearly 3 divisions holding out there against the Germans. And the fact that they hold out really helps. And it's a real myth that the French didn't fight.
No.
You've got several actions at Abbeville, at the Gembloux Gap, in fact, earlier in the month, where the French give the Germans a real good seeing to when they're force on force. But the fact of life is that Adams sets up a series of fortified villages around the perimeter that really hold the Germans up. Number of times they have to fill gaps with reserve forces. A number of times also the Germans nearly annihilate one of our divisions, particularly at Poppering, which is a First World War memory, of course. But all the while, this perimeter holds, and people basically do a fighting retreat back towards Dunkirk.
You see, it is actually remarkable. You've got the perimeter. You've also got the corridor. So you've got the canal lines, which are defended.
Yeah, the lease. Yeah.
And you know, it's done remarkably well. And what Gort has to do is basically use what he's got, which isn't a great deal, to defend a large area. I mean, it really is a large area. So as the BEF is falling back, they're basically coming through this corridor, and fighting is happening on the corridor. He's making up units. You know, he's putting together units. You've got pioneer battalions who were never intended to fight, you know, barely been trained, some of them very old, some of them First War veterans. And they are the people who are keeping the Germans out on the corridor. And then, as you say, we have this perimeter, which was actually the organisation of the perimeter, deciding where the troops should be and which troops they should be, was done by a man who had been the general manager of the Daily Telegraph in peacetime, which gives you a sense of how, you know, who was doing this. It was everybody. It was the British nation that was involved in this.
And you've got to remember that the RAF, actually, Bomber Command are involved here.
Yes.
And actually taking out quite a lot of the German logistics behind, something that's totally overlooked in these circumstances. So they're contributing at this point. But all the while, people are thinking about evacuation. But the order's not given until the 26th of May.
Hold that thought. Jens, you've set the scene brilliantly. Let's focus on the events of the evacuation of Dunkirk itself now. Now, before we get into how the British were able to pull off the evacuation, let's just run you through some of the key statistics. In total, 338,226 Allied soldiers were evacuated, including around 220,000 British and 120,000 French. Now, this was done with the help of over 933 naval vessels, of which 236 were lost. Obviously, every casualty is a tragedy, but they were remarkably low, with approximately 16,000 French and 1,000 British troops killed during the evacuation. 106 RAF planes were lost, nearly 64,000 vehicles were abandoned, and 500,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. Now, I've outlined there just how monumental this evacuation was. Joshua, how on earth were they able to pull it off? And I suppose, crucially, first of all, who even came up with the idea of let's evacuate? Well,
I mean, there were moves, plans, you know, quite early on, relatively early on in May, for a contingent evacuation, but nobody intended it to really happen. This was just, you know, a vague contingency. I mean, I think here Lord Gort doesn't get the credit that he deserves, because I think from the 19th he's seriously considering an evacuation. This is against the wishes of Churchill and the generals back at home, and then he actually comes up with the idea, puts it into practice on the 25th, starts to put it into practice, and this is a point where, you know, the French don't know. The French think it's a simple retreat to a safer area. The Germans pick up on it fairly quickly, but without Gort's decision, you know, the BEF may well have been lost. And there's another point here I'd like to pick up on, which is it's often said that Hitler was giving the British a golden bridge.
No way.
There's this idea that because he considered the British racial equals, because he didn't want to defeat them, he wanted to carve the world up between the British Empire, the Germans, that he was allowing the British to get away. It's absolute nonsense. He was not. I mean, if you look at the number of ships that were sunk and destroyed, if you look at the attempts the Germans made to infiltrate, if you look at what the Luftwaffe tried to do to wipe out the British Expeditionary Force, he was not offering a golden bridge.
It was quite clear in his orders that the Belgian, French and British forces were to be destroyed. Yeah. There is no equivocation.
One of his directives actually categorically said that.
Yeah, and this story only comes from Joshonek, who is a Luftwaffe senior officer, And I agree with Joshua, it has no basis whatsoever. They wanted to annihilate the British Expeditionary Force.
So Churchill seizes on this idea of, OK, let's evacuate the BEF and, well, however many we can. But originally they're thinking 30,000.
Well, about 40,000, James, actually, and they think it's going to take place over 2 days. And that's based on their experience in Norway. Yeah. So they've seen the Luftwaffe in operation in Norway. They think they can last that long under that sort of attack. And, of course, we see it actually runs from the 26th of May right through to the 4th of June in the end.
And I think at the beginning, you've got Churchill with one expectation, Admiral Ramsay, who was in charge from Dover, of the evacuation, thought a few more might get away. But I don't think anyone really predicted it would be the success. You see, you've got to be very careful. You see, you've got to be very careful calling Dunkirk a success. Because as Churchill said...
It's a failure.
It's a failure.
Yeah.
It's a defeat. But within that defeat, there is this remarkable achievement that keeps the war going. So, it's it's an overwhelming defeat. But within it, there is hope.
And of course, what is so remarkable about Dunkirk and the evacuation there is the fact that it's a civilian flotilla that does much of the heavy lifting. Where does that idea...
You're
going to push back on that? It's not.
I'm afraid I'm going to push back on that.
OK, go on then, correct me.
Absolutely not. OK, most of the small boats that come across only do it in the latter stages, probably over the space of about 2 days. The bulk of the heavy lifting is done by Royal Navy destroyers, which are offshore. They're also on the Eastern Mole, which is absolutely critical as a berthing, because the facilities in Dunkirk themselves have been destroyed by German artillery and also by bombing. And it's the real genius of a captain in the Navy called William Tennant, who later is the captain of HMS Repulse when it's sunk by the Japanese. He also then takes part in D-Day. He actually brings across the Mulberry Harbours and things like that, who says, look, we'll get them onto the beaches, we'll get them onto the Eastern Mole, and the bulk of it was done by Royal Navy destroyers.
So of the, 300-odd thousand, how many were evacuated by the Navy, would you say?
Pretty much all of them, all but 40,000 of them.
Well, there were civilian ships, there were ferries. I mean,
There were transports, the fact of life, but essentially even most of the little ships were manned by naval ratings.
Oh, no, that's a very important point.
Yeah.
So, you had mainly destroyers, minesweepers, and they mainly got men off at the Mole.
Yeah.
You did have ferries and civilian ships, some. One that I always think of is Crested Eagle, which I visited, and it was alongside the Mole on the day that the sky cleared enough for the Stukas to come down and attack the Mole. And this was a ship that managed to push off. It was full of men. It had to go parallel to the shore because of the tide, and Stukas came down again, and it attacked it, and something like 300 men were killed on board. The skipper brought it ashore, and it's still there. Low tide, you can see it. But there's this idea that Mrs. Miniver, Clem Miniver, taking a ship and bringing it over. It's not true. Yeah. I mean, again, you see, because none of these things are categorical, it did happen occasionally.
Yes.
Lightoller.
And there's a romance to it.
There's a romance to it. Lightoller, who was a senior surviving officer from the Titanic, did in fact bring over his own. But for the most part, it was naval ratings who brought these small boats over. Small boats, again, they weren't to take people back to Britain. They were there to bring people off the beach onto the larger ships on shore because of the geography of Dunkirk. The larger ships simply couldn't get in.
And Chris, if we just focus again on the map we've got here, which is, we've zoomed in a bit now, so we're actually looking at Dunkirk and the area around in northern France itself, and of course they're trapped up against the channel here. If you have hundreds of thousands of Allied troops on the beaches at Dunkirk, and you've got the Luftwaffe flying overhead, do they not... surely the Germans realise, hang on a minute, the Allies are evacuating. Does that not change the German thinking?
Yes, it does, but they're being held up. They were held up in Boulogne. Churchill put forces into Boulogne. He put forces into Calais, so they're delayed coming along the coast. They've got all sorts of problems, as we've said already, actually dealing with the perimeter here. And the critical thing at Dunkirk is during the time of the evacuation, from 26th of May to the 4th of June, it's only good flying weather for 2.5 days.
Yes.
So the Germans can't actually get their Stukas in particular into operation on any more days than that.
Yeah.
The other thing they do is they keep bombing the wrecks. So once they've sunk a ship, they keep coming in and bombing the wrecks instead of the ones. What would have made a real difference at Dunkirk, real difference, and if I'd have been on the German side here, I would have sown the whole offshore area with magnetic mines. And unfortunately, the Germans have been so prolific in using magnetic mines from 1939 onwards. We know what they're about.
Yeah.
But if you'd have sown the area with magnetic mines, this would have been impossible.
You see, what's really interesting about the magnetic mines, you've got, I love the word boffins, used to be in the newspapers all the time. You've got a boffin named Charles Goodeve, who has found a way to basically neutralise magnetic mines. And, you know, it's very, very recent he's done this, and please don't ask me the science of it, but basically, perhaps you know, he wipes...
It's called degaussing.
Degaussing, named after a scientist called Gauss, and also because it rhymes with delousing. And basically what he does is to make the ships, by passing a large coil over them, impervious to magnetic mines. So only two, and partly it's because there weren't that many mines out there as well, only 2 ships were sunk by magnetic mines. Plenty of ships were sunk by contact mines, you know, by bombing, by lots of other means, but not magnetic mines. And another thing was the Germans didn't attack the receiving ports, which again might have made a difference. So it wasn't that the Germans didn't try.
They didn't have the airframes, Joshua. You know, they're harnessing the Luftwaffe. They're repairing the Luftwaffe after the attacks that have taken place, obviously with the sickle cut, preparing for case red down here in the south. And their serviceability is really low at this point. So I suspect that's the reason. They don't actually have the spare capacity.
But also the RAF played a part. You know, we think, because these things go down, you know, history is made by the people who shout the loudest. And it was shouted very loud that the RAF weren't there. And at the time, you had the Army and the Navy saying, where was the RAF? To the point that, you know, there were RAF men who weren't even allowed on the ships as they were evacuating. One man I met had to change out of his uniform in order to get on board a ship. He was too scared to try to get on board a ship on the Mole, dressed as in his RAF uniform. But the fact was, of course, they were there. There were many reasons why they weren't seen. I mean, there were a limited number of them, so the patrols had to come over, you know, at intervals. They also came, for the most part, very high. You had, so that they wouldn't be seen, you know, to cut off the Germans. There was no point doing it on the beaches. They had to fly further behind to cut them off.
And remember, the RAF got the same problem the Luftwaffe have in coming over with fighters to Britain.
Very short
having
time.
to cross the Channel. There is another issue as well. Hugh Dowding doesn't want to waste his fighters because he thinks there's going to be a Battle of Britain. And it's significant that the only fighters that come across come from 11 Group, which is in the southeast. The Midlands and the North, none of the fighter groups are used at all in this, despite the fact that Dowding is told to send everything he's got. He doesn't. He thinks, and the worst thing as far as Dowding is concerned is that they don't lose in northern France because he doesn't want to commit all these fighter assets. But as we said earlier, you've got Bomber Command actually helping here, bombing the supply lines and things like that. They're also bombing German E-boats in the Channel to stop them interfering, perhaps even laying mines and things like that. But you know, this is not an easy job when you've got the weather low. In fact, the Dean of St Paul's afterwards, who called it the miracle of Dunkirk, said, you know, the mist that came down every day, you know, must have been from God. He calls it God's breath, you know, and that's something that's really highlighted. You've also got pools of smoke here from burnt stores, but also oil depot here is on fire. And of course, all the ships that have been hit as well. But we shouldn't underestimate. I mean, the little ships, you know, did a lot of work inshore, getting people off the beaches, off the Mole into ships that are offshore. There's no question about that. But the bulk of the work was done, as we said, by destroyers, to the extent that, you know, 23 were damaged, 6 British destroyers sunk, 3 French destroyers sunk. You know, and they're going back and forth at speed. That's the point. You can get 900 people on the destroyer and go really fast.
And in terms of the logistics of the evacuation, Joshua, British first, French later.
Yes, so it was very much decided the most important thing, and you can see why, was to get the British home first. In fact, the person who insisted that the French should, come in large numbers was Churchill.
Yeah.
He went out to France and did one of his Churchillian loud, bras dessous. We must go arm in arm. And from that point onwards, then the French started to come. So you had really a very significant, over 100,000 French coming back. But of course, the French more or less went straight back out to France after that. So they weren't a particularly useful commodity to bring home.
I mean, there was a 50-50 rule that came in towards the end. In fact, the operation is extended by 36 hours by Somerville in particular, who's Ramsay's deputy, to actually pick up as many French as you can. But as Joshua says, quite a few of them went back again. What you also have to remember, there are nearly 200,000 British south of the Somme.
Yes.
Still there.
Yes.
There's RAF, there's logistics people, and what Churchill has in mind, and remember, France isn't defeated yet, is the idea of a second BEF. And they actually start talking about putting a redoubt, as they call it, in Brittany, holding Brittany. Alan Brooke is put in charge of that, one of the generals who has escaped. And that's one of the critical things, of course, we have to remember about Dunkirk, is we actually saved quite a lot of our famous generals from being captured. Montgomery, Alan Brooke, Alexander, Adam.
Yes.
And more importantly, the bulk of the trained officers and NCOs.
Yes.
They came off the beaches. So
Actually, Gort wanted to stay. And it was Churchill was absolutely, you are not.
You're out.
You could just imagine, the photograph of Gort looking sheepish next to Hitler. You're absolutely not.
But the key thing is, there's this idea that we're staying in France. So the fact that some of these French went back is all part of that, to reform this second BEF. We start with 2 divisions, actually, and say we've got 2 divisions. And Alan Brooke turns around and says, you know what? We need 10. And Churchill said, we haven't got 10. We certainly don't have the equipment because we've just lost it.
But then hindsight's such a wonderful thing. Of course, the Allies were totally defeated. Well, it didn't necessarily seem
Joshua,
so at
not
the time.
quite. I mean, remember, the Germans haven't turned south at this point to defeat the French. So it's a reasonable call to say, if we hold Brittany...
No, that's what I mean. Hindsight tells us that it was all over. But actually, at the time...
It didn't look that way.
It absolutely wasn't necessarily like that.
You used the phrase the miracle of Dunkirk, which a lot of people still use, Joshua. To what extent was it a miracle? How miraculous was it? And how close did it come to failing?
Well, it came very close to failure. I mean, the miracle is such a loaded word, isn't it? Because it's got this sense of the divine
intervention,
but that's what was preached at St Paul's immediately afterwards, and that was the mood of the country.
It was remarkable.
It's like the Armada. A lot of the rhetoric is about like after the Armada.
And a lot. If you speak to, it's too late now, but if you spoke to veterans, a lot of them said, they prayed, and these were not religious people. When in extremists, people suddenly return to what they once knew and what might help. So, at the time, I think it did, and it was people were more religious, perhaps not greatly, but more religious than they are today in Britain, and Christianity meant more. So I think it was, it was easy to put it in those terms. And there's no doubt, the odds were stacked against the British Expeditionary Force.
I think the key point at this point of the war is that every time Britain tries to muddle through, like in the Norway campaign, it really messes up. But when you have a really well-planned operation, and the evacuation was well-planned, there's no question about that, it goes really well. And this is the real lesson from this period, is when you try this sort of British amateurism, sort of shire folk going out and improvising and things like that, it always goes wrong.
But there's a lot of improvising here, but it's done by men who are able to do it. So as you said before, you've got Tennant arriving in Dunkirk. He arrives, things are total chaos. Absolute chaos. He stamps his authority. He comes up with a brilliant idea, bringing them, first of all, sending the men, out of the cellars in the more or less destroyed town and harbour of Dunkirk, out onto the beaches, but then finds there aren't enough small ships to get them off, so brings the mole into action.
And indeed lands naval parties to keep discipline.
Yes.
Because the soldiers, are becoming very undisciplined.
You've got beachmasters all the way up who are controlling the queues. You know, I met one man, Vic Viner, who'd been a beachmaster. He was fascinating to talk to because he spoke about the fact that, you know, for the most part, the queues were orderly, but he had to pull his gun several times. Never used it, but others say that they had to. So, you know, history is never straightforward. The past life is never straightforward.
It's messy. I mean, you get stories of officers going along the lines to encourage the men, but sort of finding themselves at the front of the queue, you know, and you can see these sort of behaviours all over the place, and it needed real discipline. But I can't stress enough how well planned it was. If you look at the actual planning documents and the signals,
yes, that's true.
It's a very tight organisation. This is why it succeeds. That's why it's not a miracle. But as I said, you know, although you can have sort of initiative and improvisation at the tactical level, if you have it at the strategic level, you're always vulnerable to it being messed up. And this was well planned, and we're quite good at it.
And in the end, having originally been designed to evacuate 30 to 40,000 troops, over 300,000 troops get evacuated. Churchill delivers his famous "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech, and what was really a military defeat gets turned almost in the popular imagination into a moral victory and a huge boost for British morale at a crucial time. That is the real history of what happened during the Dunkirk evacuation. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, time now to ask some really big long-term questions. Had the evacuation of Dunkirk not been a success, then what would have happened for the rest of the war, or certainly in the immediate aftermath? Joshua, to start with you, I mentioned a moment ago Churchill's famous "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech. That sense of a morale boost at a crucial time in the war was critical, or has that been slightly overplayed?
Well, for one thing, people often remembered hearing that on the radio. They didn't. That was a speech that was delivered in Parliament. So it's interesting how, you know, again, hindsight plays on people's memories, because that became the sort of the defining, history turned into the defining speech. Actually, as the soldiers were coming back, so many of them were completely demoralised. As far as they were concerned, they had been involved in a terrible and shameful defeat.
Well, this is featured in the film that you worked on, Dunkirk, where they talk about they're going to be spitting at us in the street.
Absolutely. And I would argue that the fact that they weren't, you know, very quickly, even before really the propaganda machine had time to take over, the fact was these people were coming back, and it was clear, first of all, that family members were coming home, people who might easily have been lost, fathers, uncles, sons, they were coming home, and secondly, the country still had a fighting chance of survival. Now, these things were basically, I think, created an initial kind of organic Dunkirk spirit, a knee-jerk reaction, even before J.B. Priestley could, you know, do his propaganda magic. It was then seized on by the authorities and turned into something official and, again, quasi-religious, which was also something that happened with Blitz spirit, you know, just months on.
There's another aspect as well, OK, and this is really thick on the ground, and even in Cabinet they're talking about it, and that is, this is the French's fault. OK, the French have lost this, you know, we haven't, you know, we've actually got away, and in fact General Ironside actually has to round on Herbert Morrison, who blames, you know, the French for all of this and that and the other, and said no, they fought bravely, and this, that and the other. So there is a sense, you know, that the traditional enemy has lost this.
Well, blame the Allies. I mean, Belgium absolutely got it in the neck. You know, King Leopold, and I, not entirely fairly, you know, was the Belgians had given up, you know, they had capitulated. It was the word.
I think the problem there, Joshua, is it was a constitutional monarchy, and he took the personal decision. He didn't actually consult, you know, the civilian authorities about surrendering.
But again, initially the French, you know, as you said earlier, you know, the idea was the French could carry on initially. So at very first, you know, the French weren't actively blamed too much because they had to be. I mean, you know, look at Churchill's speech. It's a fascinating speech because, as in so many of those speeches of his, he's playing to many different audiences at once. You know, he's saying, we will fight them on the beaches, on the landing ground. That's guerrilla warfare. Once the Germans are here, he's actually saying, you know, they're likely to come. But he's also speaking to the French, trying to rally the French.
Well, he even says, let's have a merger of our two countries at the last minute. He says it's to pour encourager, to encourage them. And of course, the French go, we're not having any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing in France we've got to bear in mind is that the generals, Weygand and the others, are more worried about popular insurrection and communist disaffection than they are about defeating the Germans.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary the
there's
way
a lot at play.
France falls apart in that sense.
On Churchill, I mean, I think this is one of the interesting counterfactuals about had Dunkirk played out differently, because, the genius of that speech in part is that he's able to spin what was a military defeat into a kind of moral victory. And had it been a moral failure as well, had they not evacuated at all and essentially the BEF is wiped out, well, then people go, hang on, Churchill's the man who oversaw Gallipoli, Churchill's the man who oversaw the Norway campaign, now we've got disaster at Dunkirk. Does Churchill's position then come into question only a matter of weeks after taking office?
It becomes very, very tenuous if he's overseen this, phenomenal defeat. How much his part or not in it might well have been irrelevant. You've got, even as things were, you had, while the evacuation was actually taking place, you had a meeting in cabinet. It was discussed, and Churchill discussed whether actually peace terms ought to be offered, done through the Italians, who weren't quite in the war yet.
Yeah.
And it was really Halifax who was pushing this line, that if we go through Italy, then we could get more favourable terms. Now, what you had was Churchill banging the table. Countries that go down fighting don't rise again. You also had Attlee, who made the more Attleean point that if we start peace negotiations, then morale will fall apart in the country. You'll never get the country to back the government on anything it does after that. So in the end, clearly, there were no peace negotiations, and the wider cabinet, or absolutely, even the Labour members, Herbert Morrison, and people who would have been so anti-Churchill, before the war, they were all as one at this point, that we have to keep on fighting.
But of course, that is predicated on the fact that we did have the BEF after the Dunkirk evacuation. Yes. If it has been wiped out, Chris, does that not change the equation?
Well, let's go back to the Chief of Staff assessment before the evacuation, which said, actually, you know what? If there's a certain eventuality, they call it, which is basically the fall of France, what are our prospects? They anticipate losing the BEF. And they say, frankly, as long as the RAF and the Navy are intact, we're fine. Yeah. You get a few dissenters, but the fact of life is, as the Germans themselves realised, it's not just a geographic problem. You've got to get rid of the RAF and you've got to get rid of the Royal Navy for any sort of assault on the UK.
Well, this is the Battle of Britain.
But even if you get rid of the RAF, you've still got the Royal Navy to deal with, which is something that people often forget. And you've still got to get across this very extensive river crossing, as the German General Staff called it, 20 miles of it.
And can you imagine, destroyers going up and down whilst, the Germans were preparing an invasion force, but it wasn't strong. And the destroyers could basically have knocked the invasion force out of the sea.
Submarines, mines, all sorts of things are in the way. The other thing is, Hitler was never serious about Sea Lion. It was a means of putting pressure on Britain to say, look, I'm preparing an invasion force. It was also therapeutic for the German Navy, who'd been absolutely hammered in the Norwegian campaign. None of their capital ships were really ready to go out. They didn't have enough U-boats. They'd lost huge numbers of destroyers in the north here. And so, if you like, it was a way of actually getting the Navy back into business again. The other issue, which is quite significant with the German Navy, is their torpedoes don't work. In fact, neither did the British ones, neither did the Americans ones when they came in. Only the Japanese did. So they've got a real problem of confidence in dealing with the Royal Navy and, of course, an intact Royal
It is
Air
interesting, the views in Britain at the time. There's a meeting, the National Archives, shows that at a particular meeting at this time, Dudley Pound was saying that the Germans will be able to get through. He was the naval man. Churchill was saying, absolutely not, they won't. And I think it is probably unlikely. But the fact is, as you say, Hitler never wanted to invade, really. He, as far as he was concerned, Why isn't Britain
suing for peace? Yeah.
I mean, Grand Admiral Raeder, who's the head of the German Navy, is saying throughout, we can land you. Yeah, that's feasible, but we can't support you. There's no way we, the Navy, can support you once you're over there.
But does that calculation, I mean, I take your point, Chris, that Hitler was never serious about sea line. But if Dunkirk goes differently and the BEF is gone, does he become more serious about it?
No, he doesn't.
No, he doesn't.
He's got things here he wants to do. And remember, the reason he goes for Barbarossa is to actually say to Britain, we knock Russia out, you've got no hope.
You've got no hope.
The key point about the BEF being rescued is the effect it has on the Americans. Because the Americans say, they are going to hang on. So that allows Roosevelt a bit of space. And remember, there's a presidential election in 1940 as well, which actually counts. And that, coupled with the destruction of the French fleet at Mers el-Kébir, says to the Americans, Britain's staying in this fight.
I think the Blitz was a decisive factor here. I mean, obviously, Britain's survival here was crucial. I mean, America was heavily isolationist. And Roosevelt was really going against the grain in his support of the British. I mean, his support of the British at this point, really had nothing to do with joining the war. His support of the British was, he realised that the Nazis were an evil. And America's best chance of staying out of the war was to support the British and keep that fight going there.
It's a proxy war, just like it is with Ukraine now against Russia.
Well, is there even a scenario where you get the US entering the war earlier if Dunkirk fails because they think the British really do need our help now?
I don't think so. I don't think... Well, first of all, the Americans weren't strong enough.
That's right. The Navy wasn't a two-ocean Navy at that point. Their Air Force was part of the Army, minimal. And, of course, they had actually a smaller army than Belgium did. So that's not possible at this stage. Also, it's probably not in America's interest. They're looking, remember, to the Pacific at this stage, to China, to Japan and all that sort of thing. And we've said before on these programmes that they'd have given up Europe as lost at that point and concentrated on the Pacific probably. But what it does do, Dunkirk, the whole Dunkirk spirit, mythology and all that sort of thing translates into the American mind as, let's support the underdog. And as I said, reinforced by Mers el-Kébir and possibly the Blitz, as you say, it sees off Joe Kennedy, the ambassador, who's sending back these reports saying that Britain's
going to
finished.
lose.
So all that helps build.
It undoubtedly, the Americans, in Churchill's speech that we've already discussed, he finishes off by saying that, the new world, when you come to the rescue of the old. That's the last thing he says. That's a message to Roosevelt. And for a long time at this period, Roosevelt wasn't responding to Churchill. They were basically lovers having their tiff.
He's been ghosted by Roosevelt.
He was being ghosted for quite a long time.
I mean, they fell out. I mean, they didn't like each other. I mean, Roosevelt had been slighted by Churchill during the First World War.
Well, what's fascinating is that Churchill didn't even remember it. Roosevelt hadn't liked Churchill when they'd met at Gray's Inn. And Churchill hadn't even remembered it, which was another slight all over again. So, they hadn't got off to a good start. And, it was all pragmatism at this point. Whatever the special relationship became at a later date, at this point, it was nothing more than pragmatism insofar as anything even existed in terms of a relationship.
So if you're looking almost at the path to Lend-Lease, just under a year later, the crucial staging posts are Dunkirk and then the Battle of Britain and the Blitz.
I mean, to me, yes, Dunkirk, certainly. The Battle of Britain, where some Americans, flew. The Blitz, absolutely, because you had these reports coming back from Ed Murrow, that the British are holding on, and that did have an effect on morale in America. I wouldn't say it shifted it particularly, but it certainly, the Americans started to sympathise. But then also, Roosevelt was trying to ramp up help. There were the destroyers, the old clapped-out destroyers that were given to the British, but it was always for a price. In return, they got use of naval and military bases. Lend-Lease again, Churchill, Lend-Lease has gone down as this remarkable, selfless act. Well, it wasn't. Roosevelt was a good businessman. He insisted on consideration. And so you had, for example, these huge gold supplies, which were in South Africa. American ships just came and took it away. And Churchill was outraged at the time. It was only afterwards he talked about I forget his word, the least ungenerous act, something like that. But it was only afterwards. So the British-American relationship was very, very much rockier than we remember for quite a long time. So America wouldn't have come in at this stage. Now, there's a fascinating film called It Happened Here. I don't know if you know this, made in the mid-60s. And the conceit of this is that the Germans, well, it's not quite explained whether the Germans had invaded or whether peace terms were made. Because peace terms, as we say, Halifax Churchill had two very, very different views. Halifax, who was interested in making overtures towards the Germans. To Halifax, Britain was a geographical entity. As long as his estate was safe, Britain could continue as it had been going, with village life and a sort of H.E. Bates type existence. For Churchill, it wasn't that at all. For Churchill, it was a case of freedom and rule of law and, the birthplace of liberty, and that had to be continued onwards. Now, both are very romantic notions, actually, but Churchill's, fortunately, was the one that won out. So, peace was a possibility. And what It Happened Here does is take this conceit and basically, later in the war, this idea, the Germans are in Britain, but they're having great difficulty with Russia, so the troops have to be moved out of Britain. The United States is much stronger by this point, so it is able to launch an invasion of Western England, and the British people, we then get an insight into how so many have collaborated, and the divide in Britain between those who have...
sort of Vichy Britain against Free Britain.
Partisans, again, and it's a fascinating... Because almost certainly that is what would have happened. But the initial question is whether it could have happened, whether... if Britain had fallen, where would D-Day have been launched from? It's...
Well, this brings us on to an interesting point, Chris, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this. If the BEF is wiped out of Dunkirk, even if Britain continues in the war and decides, OK, we've got the Navy still, we've got the Air Force, we can defend our island, do you ever see British troops in Europe again for the rest of the war?
Yeah, I think you do, because once France is finished, they'll consolidate here, both economically and politically. They'll use the resources of the continent, and they're going to turn east. Now, the key point for Britain is whether Russia gets knocked out, the Soviet Union gets knocked out. That's the key point. Because if the Soviet Union does get knocked out, then obviously it becomes very difficult to hold this position off a Nazi-dominated Europe. I think what's really interesting is it was well known what the plans for Britain were from the Nazis. It started off saying, well, it's going to be a bit like Norway. We'll have a sort of Quisling government here. We're going to bring Edward VIII back, by the way. It's the Nazi plan, because we like him and he likes us. They had, bizarrely, they were going to dominate with London, Glasgow, obviously Cardiff. They also had a plan for invading Ireland called Plan Green, which they were going to take over. But for some reason, they focused on Bridgnorth as being, in Shropshire, as being the place where they wanted to run Britain from. And they thought that Blackpool would be a great place as a Nazi sort of resort area. But in a more sinister way, they wanted to harness all the economic resources, the shipbuilding and all that sort of thing. And they wanted to deport all the males between 17 to 42 to the continent.
All the fighting age males.
As basically industrial labour. So that was a pretty dark prospect. And that actually seeped into consciousness. But what I find interesting myself, Joshua, and I'm sure you found the same, is that nobody thought they were going to lose in Britain.
That's very interesting.
My mother, who's, God bless her, 95 now, remembers distinctly that nobody in the wake of Dunkirk thought there was, or even while Dunkirk was going on, that we would lose at any stage. And I find that quite remarkable, given what we're looking at, and we're going, it's all very bad. It's a really heavy situation, if you quote the young ones. But nobody's thinking that in Britain. Now, whether, that's after Dunkirk, I don't think it is. I think it's even before Dunkirk. How that would have been affected if we'd lost all our men, because they're all related, we'd lost all our trained manpower and all that sort of thing, I don't know. What we did do, of course, and Joshua's hinted about this, is we absolutely bankrupted ourselves trying to replace the equipment that was lost on the continent. And we were talking about 3,000 guns, of which 800 are very heavy caliber guns. We're talking about huge numbers of vehicles. We had the Royal Army Service Corps going around every scrapyard trying to get old trucks and buses for transport, which were even used during D-Day. So we were really on the bones of it to try and re-equip. And, you know, we basically used all our gold reserves. We absolutely mortgaged ourselves to the hilt. And it's very interesting that the period between Dunkirk and Pearl Harbor essentially sees the end of Britain as a great power.
I think that's right. But you see, as far as the people are concerned, I think you're right. I think the majority of people in Britain absolutely didn't think that, you know, Britain would lose even at that point. And if you, as I did, speak to them or look at their accounts, they talk about the fact, you know, even if the Germans got here, you know, they wouldn't win. You know, and that's despite the fact that, as you say, you know, British, you know, most of our military supplies had been left in France. There was this great sort of, having said that I found various accounts, you know, one woman who stockpiled aspirins and said, if the Germans get here, I'm going to feed these to my daughter. I spoke to another woman who said that her mother had got hold of a revolver, and it was a wonderful conversation we had. I said, you know, what for? She said she would have killed my brother and I had the Nazis come. And I said, so would she have used the gun, really? Did she know how? Oh, I'm sure. Mother didn't make idle threats. That was what this woman said.
Yeah.
And another person who said, you know, his parents had bellows by the door filled with pepper. And if the Germans came, they were going to blow pepper. So, you know, in their faces at the door. But so, whilst people didn't believe it, some were prepared for it.
I mean, what we didn't have in Britain, it seems to me, if you read the tenor of the Times, is what was in France. And we hear the French talking about this themselves. They said most of their generals and politicians were sulkily defeatist. I think really sums up the situation. And this whole period between Reynard and Laval being put in as the sort of prime minister, there's this idea that actually we've got bigger problems at home than we have with the Germans. That's never the case in Britain.
No.
I think.
Well, we have a different history.
Yeah,
exactly.
Joshua, final thought from you on how significant a turning point Dunkirk is.
It's a massively significant turning point. You know, it's a victory, although not, you know, carved out of an absolutely monumental defeat. It was certainly a turning point in terms of British morale. It was a turning point, as you say, in terms of how Britain is viewed. America, you know, Britain was still in the fight, so America could still, at some level at this point, back Britain. And Dunkirk spirit has become a sort of, you know, rightly or wrongly, this defining idea of who we are. It's invoked at every few years. Some large event is put down to Dunkirk spirit. You know, we only get going when our backs are against the wall, and we always survive. Unlike, you know, all of these other nations who are much more prone to emotion, and we are the true survivors. So, I mean, in so many ways. Also, I think the fact is that, you know, over the last years, you know, it may have played on Americans' minds at the time. It's been forgotten. You know, it's a parochial little British thing that, you know, the Russians don't remember the American. It's true that every nation thinks it won the war, but this part of the war, absolutely, you know, hasn't been remembered. It's one reason why the film, I think, is quite important, because it alerted a whole new generation of people to the fact it even happened. And the fact that it happened, whether you think it kept the war going or not, the fact is it was still, you know, a pivotal moment in the war that needs to be remembered.
Chris, final thoughts?
Well, I think it's decisive because if you look at circumstances around the Atlantic Charter and things like that, if we hadn't got our army off, the one thing Britain was always short of in World War II was manpower. If we'd lost 250,000 men at that point, including the trained manpower, it would have been very difficult. And I just wonder if Germany first would have survived. at that point in the Atlantic Charter. You know, and we'd have ended up in a situation after Pearl Harbor where they said, right, you just hold on in Britain. We're not coming for D-Day just yet. We're going to deal with the Japanese first. It may have altered the whole tenor of the campaign. But again, that it's contingent on what happens here in the East as well. I mean, my own sense is that it echoes down to today, Dunkirk. That's the point. It lives with us. It's part of our national consciousness. The fact that the film revived it in 2017 means that there is an audience that will appreciate it. It's part of our national mythology, what we believe about ourselves, and it fortifies us for the future. I remember, you know, when I was in the Falklands myself, I remember thinking, we really can't mess up here. What would people from World War II, what would Nelson, what would Drake think if we messed it up? So that really builds national consciousness and confidence for the future. And this is a complex operation. To pull this off today, I guarantee Britain couldn't do it.
I think that's a very good point about America first. I think, you know...
Germany first, yeah.
I think that's a very good point about Germany first.
Yeah.
Because even as it was, there were plenty of people in America who absolutely felt, you know, the Pacific is where we should be looking. And that's as things were. So if Dunkirk, the evacuation hadn't happened and Britain had held on, the fact is that I think it is probable that America wouldn't have considered Britain a good bet for a long time to come.
Well, gents, this has been absolutely fascinating. We could talk about this for hours. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I think what we've learned is that absolutely the evacuation of Dunkirk was, in many senses, pretty miraculous and could have played out very differently. And had the weather been different, had the halt order not been issued when it was, there is a scenario in which the BEF may well have been wiped out on the beaches at Dunkirk. And had that happened, the rest of the Second World War could have looked very different. Of course, there is speculation about, does Churchill survive? Does Halifax come in? Does Britain sue for peace? But even if that doesn't happen and Britain fights on, the rest of the war could look very, very different, because how America views the British would be very, very different. And as we've just been discussing, does Germany first actually take effect as the main policy of the war, or do the Americans pursue the Pacific first? Some really big long-term consequences, all stemming from the evacuation of Dunkirk back in 1940. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Joshua Levine for joining me, and of course thank you to our sponsors, Visit Malta. Remember, if you want to find out how you can explore more wonder and learn about Malta's rich history and culture, head to visitmalta.com. And we'll be back undoing more history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. You can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.